begin this webinar initiative, which is something we had in the works for a long time, but which we moved up, of course, due to the COVID-19 crisis. We hope that this webinar and the ones that follow in upcoming months will allow all of you to remain personally and intellectually engaged with AEN's work during these challenging times. Just a technical note for everyone, the chat and Q&A function will be off during Gil's presentation, but you should be able to send in questions immediately after that. And we definitely encourage you to do so. We want this to be a very interactive and engaging event. So without any further ado, I want to introduce Miriam Ellman, AEN's Executive Director, who will also say a few words and introduce Professor Troy.
Well, thank you so much, Rafa. Thank you, Gil. And thank you so much to all our members and our supporters and funders for joining us this afternoon. Before I introduce Gil, I just want to say a few more words about our webinar series, which, as Rafa noted, has been in the works, and we are moving it forward a bit. So we're really happy to launch it. If it weren't for COVID, we'd be meeting with many of you in a regional short course that was already in the works and being planned when campuses shut down. We'd be meeting with you in in-person convenings around the country, but all that will have to wait. And for now, we're really hoping to take advantage of lots of different online opportunities for our members. The webinar series will host leading scholars and practitioners. What we're really trying to do is focus on different aspects of academic freedom and campus free speech, including how to combat anti-Semitism while protecting free expression, how to address BDS in the classroom and on the quad, and the opportunities and challenges that the pandemic raises for AEN's work and our issues. So stay tuned for those upcoming webinars, and we hope you can join us for many of them as they fit your schedule. So I want to introduce Gil. Many of you know Gil Troy. He is a distinguished scholar in North American history at McGill University. He's joining us from Jerusalem, where he currently resides. He's an award-winning American presidential historian. He's a leading Zionist activist. His book, Moynihan's Moment, America's Fight Against Zionism and Racism, describes the fall of the UN and the spread of anti-Zionism. And it's truly, and it's an outstanding book, personally among my favorites. And Gil, you may not know, but at Syracuse University, my office is a floor above the Moynihan Institute for Global Affairs. There's a big portrait of Moynihan as you enter, and every day I would pass it by. So your book really helped me to understand how truly remarkable Moynihan was. Today, as Rafa noted, Gil will be sharing his insights from this really remarkable, outstanding book. I encourage all of you to read it. Some of you will be getting it for free because you signed up early for this webinar. It's extraordinary, and we think it'll be really helpful for our faculty as we work to combat anti-Semitism and virulent anti-Israel activism on campus. So Gil will speak for about 15 minutes, and then we look forward to opening it up to your comments and your questions. So Gil, the floor is all yours.
Well, thank you, Miriam, and thanks to all of you. I'm humbled and honored to see so many people, and not just the quantity, but the quality of the people. Many of my heroes are on this call, and I've learned so much from so many of you. You know, I think you actually have to change your name from the Academic Engagement Network to the Academic Rescue Network, because I think that's really what's going on here. And you know, I, like all of you, am a case of arrested development. I got to the campus and I fell in love with the university. And it's painful. It's really painful to see what's been happening, not just in terms of Israel and Zionism and anti-Semitism on the campus, but we really are the canary in the coal mine. It's a cliche, but we really are an indicator of a much bigger and deeper and uglier cancer that is really affecting how we teach, how we think, and we're lost causes. The problem is the next generation, and so it's really very heartening to see so many of you who are willing to be on the front lines and make things happen. So we now are at the most challenging part of the evening, because can I get to the right screen and start with my PowerPoint? So is that technical challenge? And nope, it seems to be working. Does everybody see the slideshow?
We're looking at your Word document.
Wait a minute. Do you have a?
We're seeing chapter 2.
No, that's the wrong thing. Okay. So I'm going to stop share and try again. One more time. I think this will work. There we go. Yeah.
Much better. Thank you.
So, a new model for combating anti-Semitism and anti-Israel on campus was the topic that was given to me. And from the start, we already start quibbling with language, because how we phrase things is very important. I prefer the phrase Jew hatred, sorry, that's a misprint, and xenophobia. Xenophobia is a term taken from Judea Pearl. Anti-Semitism sounds just way too clinical, way too sterile, made up by our enemies, as many of you well know. And Jew hatred is more kind of primal and gets to the essence of what's going on. And xenophobia, Judea Pearl, the father of Daniel Pearl, argues, emphasizes that the hatred of Israel itself is a deep form of bigotry and is also a form of insanity. Now, the big question is this, and this is a perception game I love to play with students. Which Israel do you see? Every time I say Israel, do you think of religious conflict? Do you think of the Palestinian conflict? Or the opposite extreme, also a mistake? Do you think of an Israel of blue and white flowers and Hava Nagila and perfection? I'm smothering. I'm suffocating. I'm being smothered by the insanity of the left, which only sees the negative and then goes into delegitimization derby. I dislike this policy or this prime minister, or I'm not afraid of the word, the occupation, and therefore Israel doesn't have the right to exist. We don't do that with the United States of America. We don't do it with China. Why do we do it with Israel? And when the counter is, well, therefore we cannot have any self-critical conversation, that how does a democracy grow without some self-criticism? So what I want to emphasize today is a few ideas. One, that we have to take it personally, that we really have to. I mean, look, as academics, we're not in it for the money. Most of us are not in it for the book sales. But we have to show that we really are engaged in this. And that's why I actually like the name Engagement Network. That this is an important issue, that this is, Erwin Kotler says that one of the challenges you have to do is find your 10 closest non-Jewish friends and share with them your distress when there's an active anti-Semitism, an active anti-Zionism. And that's a kind of form of coalition building, which we're terrible at. But while taking it personally, we also have to be proportional. The constant hysteria, the constant conversation about how Israel's being beaten up and treating every form of criticism as a form of delegitimization also doesn't help us. So we have to try to strike that balance. And one of the things I've been calling for is naming and shaming, calling out those people who are abusive. And this is a really difficult issue. And I'm in my few minutes just kind of raising a whole bunch of issues. We can go into more detail, obviously, in the Q&A. As professors, we always have to be careful that ultimately, my job is I'm an American historian. I'm paid to teach American history on campus. I'm paid not to create so much static in the classroom when I walk in, because I've been so politicized that my African-American students, my Arab students, my left-wing students, my right-wing students can't learn from me. And so I think we have to know that students fight students and that professors challenge or confront professors. And if we err on the side of sometimes being a little bit too cautious, that's okay. Third idea. I want to introduce a concept which I've been trying to introduce for years and hasn't taken off, the notion of educational malpractice. When we start yelling and screaming about politicization, we're losing a battle that unfortunately, that has already been lost. Many of our peers, we well know, look at academia as a form of politicization. But just as lawyers and doctors have to worry about malpractice, I think when we talk about malpractice in the classroom, when we talk about educational malpractice, then we're talking about what's our job as teachers? What's our job as professors? If I'm hijacking the podium to only make it a political platform, then I'm doing something abusive. And if I'm not listening to my students, I'm committing educational malpractice. Another idea where we fail miserably is we don't choose our battles. We constantly allow them to choose the battles. We constantly allow them to decide what's going to be an issue, and then we're always reactive. Sometimes don't give them so much oxygen. Sometimes ignore, and sometimes create your own approach. Ultimately, I'm calling for the jujitsu, turning the negatives into positives. We want to be proactive, not reactive, constructive, not destructive, civil, not uncivil, and ultimately, and the essence of my book, The Zionist Ideas, is while political Zionism is incredibly important, and it established the miracle of the state of Israel, and we use political Zionism as a tool to continue to defend the state of Israel and to perfect the state of Israel, I also want a deep dive into what I call identity Zionism, which is a conversation not just about how we help Israel, but how Israel, Zionism, Jewish nationalism, helps us. Now that's the theory. Let's look at 3 examples of how I try to apply this in practice at McGill University and elsewhere. So in 2004, 3 years after the awful Durban conference, McGill University decides to give Mary Robinson an honorary doctorate. Mary Robinson, of course, had been a well-known human rights advocate, and had presided over the Durban debacle. And even though at the very end she gave a press conference denouncing it, she let it get out of control. Now, as I said, I was always very cautious on the McGill campus not to be too politicized. But how could I, in 2004, in May 2004, just 2 weeks after the library in Herzliya, a Jewish day school, was firebombed by anti-Zionists who were expressing their anti-Zionism through good old-fashioned Jew hatred, how could I, as a professor, be quiet? On the other hand, not only choosing your battles, but framing your battles, I knew that once the decision was announced, they're not going to go back. So my goal was not to get McGill to rescind her honorary doctorate. I would have failed. My goal was 3 things. 1, to ruin her day, to just make enough of a storm around her getting the honorary doctorate that she would be treated differently. And in a sense, I'm an old baseball fan, just like Roger Maris ended up having an asterisk on his 61 home runs because it was a 162 game season, not a 154 game season. I want to put an asterisk on Mary Robinson's honorary doctorate. And indeed, by writing in the Montreal Gazette, by calling her out, she was forced to come to the law school where she was getting an honorary doctorate, to the law school and explain herself. They closed that quote unquote open forum to all professors but law school professors, which was basically a way of keeping me out. But she was the one person who did that. That was one I wanted to do. The second is I wanted to trigger enough of an internet trail because I know academics are cowards. And if we made enough noise about her at that moment, then in the future, academics looking and considering giving her an honorary doctorate would be cautious about it. And third, I just couldn't stand the idea of, in the list of accomplishments, them mentioning Durban. And indeed, when they called Mary Robinson up for her honorary doctorate, they skipped over the Durban conference. So on those 3 levels, we succeeded. And but it was very much a lonely fight. I learned then that when people in the Jewish community come up to you and say, "Oh, you're so courageous," that's code for "what a fool." And I, of course, made sure to show that I was a McGill patriot. I showed up to commencement in full regalia. And I can't tell you how many of my fellow Jewish academics came up to me and said, "We're behind you." And indeed, they were behind me and far too silent. So that was a moment where I really went out there. In a negative, in a reactive mode, but cautious. In May 2016, BDS starts spreading once again. And I turned to a number of professors and we put together a petition. And by the way, I've shared this with the leaders of AEN and we're happy to share this around. And we a proactive stance. I got 150 McGill professors, which I said, I want 10% of the faculty. And we did it in 3-4 days to simply sign a statement saying this is unacceptable. And as soon as I got that 10%, we declared victory and moved on. And I said, I mean, McGill professors are an infamously autonomous, let's call it, an isolated lot. And I said, the last time 150 professors did anything in common was either file their taxes or meet the deadlines for filing grades. It's just not done. And the most moving moment was when one of my colleagues, John Zucchi, an Italian Catholic, came up to me and said, thank you. I was looking for a way to respond and I didn't know how to respond. And so often we have allies whom we haven't even tapped into, whom we haven't empowered. And I called for other Canadian universities to sign on with this petition. Didn't go anywhere. So once being reactive, a second time being proactive, and a third time being silent. And this just happened a few weeks ago. I was supposed to give a talk at Harvard University, and it was going to be why I'm a Zionist. And look what happened in Thayer Hall. Look how it was ripped, how my poster was first overwhelmed by anti-posters and then ripped to shreds. Now, two things happened. One was, unfortunately, my mother died at that moment. I couldn't make the lecture, and so that made it harder to kind of get on my high horse. But of course, COVID hit. And I knew that if I had made this a federal case and it had gone on and on about anti-Zionism with the Harvard campus in March, it would have gone nowhere. So choose your battles. Let's go just for a few more minutes, a deeper dive into some of the substance of how I try to argue the case. So, I ask, my goodness, what an insanity. What are religious symbols doing on flags? And I have two answers to that. First of all, yeah, look, I don't want special treatment. I just want equal treatment. 27 European countries have religious symbols called the cross on their flags, let alone all the Muslim countries. And two, one of the things I try to teach is that this is not just a religious symbol, because as Jews, we are this unique Oreo cookie. We are both the cookie part, a nation, and the cream part, a religion. And you can't, just like in the Oreo cookie, take the two apart. What's so disturbing, and one of the things we have to call out, is that it's not a specific hatred about what Israel did or does, or who Israel is led by, but what Israel is. And that essentialism is something that we in the university have been fighting against on so many other levels, and yet somehow when it comes to Israel, we forget that. And, I was recently in Australia. I know that growing up in New York, we have issues over natives. Why is it that only Israel is the country where, because there's a dispute over two peoples in love with the same land, we're somehow delegitimized? That delegitimization derby is one of the problems we keep on falling into. And of course, we have to call out our boycotter friends, because if Israel develops a COVID vaccine, and notice how unique it is, this small country is one of the leaders in that fight, they of course won't follow along. So one of the things we have to do is be very, very specific and point out when we talk about BDS that I just take them at their word. They have said again and again that it's not just against the occupation. It's not just against Bibi. It's not just against the annexation, but BDS means the end of the Jewish state. And we've also seen at McGill and elsewhere that as soon as BDS starts, they start tweeting about Jew boys. They go from anti-Zionism, criticism of Israel, to anti-Semitism. And the burden of proof, I've learned from my gay friends, my African-American friends, my feminist friends, is not on me to prove that I'm being the victim of bigotry. It's on the bigots, or the potential bigots, to prove that they're distancing themselves from the bigots. And what we've seen again and again, where BDS enters, Jew hatred follows. And it's a whole language of delegitimization, racism, colonialism, imperialism. Those are the European sins that are being imposed on Israel. And I want to just very quickly point you at Michael Walzer's recent article in Dissent, who goes from the fact that, yeah, the criticism can be of specific Israeli moves, but the problem is the essentialism. And that essential character is something that, that is a problem in Israel. One final framing, and then we'll open up for questions. And I appreciate your patience. ultimately, when I talk about going from political Zionism to identity Zionism, when I talk about being proactive, when I talk about being doing the jujitsu, and when I think about what is the opportunity we have right now at this moment when, unfortunately, campuses are not meeting. And so the anti-Zionism and anti-Semitism that exists on campus is really pretty much going to be on hold. I think this is our opportunity to do a deep dive into core questions of who we are and who we can be. And I think of this as kind of a form of Pilates. This is Pilates Zionism, this is Pilates Judaism. If we build up our identity now, if we take this opportunity to have seminars and webinars and Zoom calls about who we are as a people and who we can be, then two things will happen. One, when it comes time to fighting again, we'll have reinforced our identity, not just in negative terms, not just on their terms, choose your battles, but on our terms. And secondly, we'll have a break. We'll stop relating to Israel as the central headache of the Jewish people. We'll stop thinking of Zionism purely in the terms of defense, and we can start really doing what the Zionist movement invited us to do, which was create a new Jew and a new Jewish conversation. So in 1959, Arthur Hertzberg comes out with the Zionist Idea, an anthology of the 34 great thinkers who created the Zionist revolution. Now think about it. In 1959, Israel was fragile, but the Zionist idea was robust. Today, Israel's robust, but the Zionist conversation often has turned fragile. And so one of the things I want to do is take back the night, bring back the word Zionism and bring it back into a context even in Jewish terms, which is more positive, freed from politics, freed from hatred. And the book became very popular. See how David Breakstone of the Jewish Agency had a very beaten up copy. And so when I was given the tremendous privilege, the daunting task of updating the Zionist idea, I made 3 moves, and with this I'll end. 1, beyond changing the cover, from the Zionist idea to the Zionist ideas. Open up the conversation from left to right, religious, non-religious, from 34 thinkers, none of whom were female, none of whom were Mizrahi. Open up. Bring in women's voices, bring in gay voices, bring in Ethiopian voices, bring in Mizrahi voices. From the Zionist idea to the Zionist ideas. And I love the S, because this is like a question mark. We went from 34 thinkers to 168 thinkers. And of course, that meant we had to shorten, because Hertzberg had 240,000 words. I only had 150,000 words. And cut, add. The first move. The second move was historicity, periodization, divide into 3 periods. 1, until 1948, the pioneers, those crazy Nudnik dreamers. 2, from 1948 to 1994, the Rabin assassination, the builders. And 3, who are we? And I asked one friend of mine, he said, oh, we're the nothings. We're the torchbearers. We are the heirs to this amazing conversation. And what are we and our students going to do with it? And part of that is taking back the night on the whole conversation of nationalism, which is a whole other conversation. And finally, and with this I'll truly end, once I had 168 thinkers, how do I organize it? So it's divided into thirds. But then I went to 6 fundamental schools of Zionist thought. And I was playing the role of zoologist. And indeed, I sometimes may have gotten it wrong. Indeed, I sometimes, because I was focusing on the words, ended up putting people in places where they didn't necessarily belong. But I loved getting the emails saying, what are you doing putting Eliezer Schweid in revisionist Zionist, not in cultural Zionism? How could you drop Kalischer? That's the kind of conversation we need to be having. And so basically, based on a Camp Tel Yehuda Pula activity, back when I was 15, I went with the 5 schools of Zionist thought and added a 6th. We were told in those days when we would create Zionist conversations, first, we need a black beard, Theodor Herzl, political Zionism. Then you need a white beard, Rav Kook, religious Zionism. Then you need a hoe, A.D. Gordon, Golda Meir, labor Zionism. Then you need a wheel, Achad Ha'am, cultural Zionism. The Jewish people are a wheel. We're at the center in Israel, and Ki Mitzion Tetzei Torah. From Zion shall come forth a new word, a new law, new ideas, Yerushalayim shel Zahav, new thoughts, new songs. So political Zionism, religious Zionism, labor socialist Zionism, cultural Zionism. You make a fist for revisionist Zionism that pointed also that it was core to liberal individualism in Israel and the startup nation. And those are the traditional 5 schools of Zionist thought that saying, Anu banu artza livnotu lihibanot ba. We've come to Israel to build and be rebuilt. And so I added, and with this I'll end, a 6th school, diaspora Zionism, identity Zionism, which basically asks the question, who am I? Who are we? And of course, in Israel, we also need a form of identity Zionism, not just political Zionism. And that conversation is the conversation we need to have amongst ourselves and with our students. What does this healthy, constructive, lowercase l, liberal form of nationalism do to us as part of the conversation and to others to model in a world where liberal nationalism is not being respected neither by the left nor by the right, to learn about how liberal nationalism can unite us, can inspire us, and can push us forward. So thank you very much. And let's continue the conversation.
Thank you so much, Gil, for that fascinating and engaging talk. I really appreciate that. We all really appreciate that. A note about the Q&A. Miriam and I have a couple of questions for Gil. That's our prerogative as AEN. But we want to, the questions are now, the chat is now opened up for questions. You can send them to me directly, especially if you don't want to share your questions with the rest of the participants. My name is Raefa, R-A-E-E-F-A. If you go into the chat, there's a drop down and you can just send the questions privately to me, and I'll be sure to get to as many as possible. Please, as always, make sure they're in the form of a question and not a comment, a rant, or a suggestion. So with that, Miriam, do you want to ask the first question?
Sure. First, Gil, thank you so much. You did that in 15 minutes and very rich discussion, not only of your perspective on how we can best combat campus anti-Israelism and what battles and fights we should pick and which ones we shouldn't, and then how we go about it and strategize effectively, but also about your book. And so, I wanted to ask you, because I think the book, the way you describe it, it's really a Jewish conversation about Jewish nationalism. And yet, in the intro, you recognize there's this rich history of non-Jews defending Zionism very eloquently, but non-Jewish voices don't appear in the book. AEN is not a Jewish organization. We have non-Jewish members and members of no faith and members of all faith. And I think you talked in your comments, in your remarks, about the allies that you've had at McGill, the Catholic professors. Same with me on my campus. The 3 most important people I can always turn to, my faculty colleagues, are a Catholic and 2 Protestants, and they will always stand by me. So I'm wondering, what's gained? What, in your view, is gained by having it be a Jewish conversation? And then do we need to have a sequel of a non-Jewish conversation on Zionism?
Thank you for that, and thank you for your kind remarks. So indeed, this is one of the things I struggled with. And I actually put together a chapter on non-Jewish voices. I mean, look, I just written a book called Moynihan's Moment, which you kindly mentioned. And that is one of the great speeches about Zionism made by anybody. And part of the reason why I wrote that book was because I wanted to find a non-Jewish liberal who defended Israel and saw the equation between anti-Zionism and anti-Semitism/Jew hatred. And so I put together a wonderful chapter going back to, Daniel Deronda and George Eliot and, Winston Churchill and Margaret Thatcher and Tony Blair and Daniel Patrick Moynihan and Reverend John Hagee and John F. Kennedy and left and right. And when I read it, there was something a little off. Because the other chapters, and first of all, there was also sort of a beautiful thing because I had 3 periods and 6 schools of thought, so it was 18, and it took a friend of mine, John O'Connor, to say, oh, 18, high, you've got high chapters. So I didn't want to make the 19th, but part of it was that most of those speeches, most of those writings were you language about how you people did this thing. And I actually went back to the original just happens to be here, The Zionist Idea, the introduction, and Arthur Hertzberg's original mandate was to look at the Jewish conversation and see how it bubbled over and created a state. Well aware of the fact, as historians know, that it was a very marginal conversation in the late 1800s, right? The big story of Jewish migration in the 1880s, 1890s, 1900s is the boat, right? Everybody's getting on the boat to America. And they're going by the millions to America and by the dozens, and often coming back in pine boxes, to Palestine. So I went to the original mandate of the book, which is to show how this conversation, this internal conversation, spilled over. And again, because I'm trying to model Zionism as a form of constructive liberal nationalism, I chose that. But I actually would love to take those, I mean, it's written, and put it together. And I've actually thought of maybe just not even making a book, but making a separate workbook that could get people seeing it, because it is a very important conversation. And I so value and cherish our non-Jewish allies. I prefer to just call them allies, or friends, or co-workers and colleagues in this, again, this broader fight for truth and sanity in the academic life. That I regret if the way I set it up ended up distancing people from that conversation. I was trying to bring people in.
Thank you.
Thanks. I'll ask one, and then we're going to move on to we're already getting in some really good questions from our listeners, which is great and not surprising considering who our members are. So my question is, you mentioned that you wanted to do this update to Arthur Hertzberg's book, which was written in the late 1950s, collated in the late 1950s. Obviously, there has been incredible change and development, demographic, economic, political, and social in Israel since that time. What do you think were the main motivators for you to do this update, and what were the primary changes that you wanted to see reflected in this edited volume?
So, I mean, Hertzberg has a couple of voices post 48, but it's mostly a pre 48 book. Mm-hmm. It's mostly a book that shows again, the extraordinary, miraculous ability of Jewish nudniks and Jewish conversation to bubble over into something real. And I wanted to build on that and show how the conversation continues. Because as I said at the beginning, when I talked about being smothered by the left and by the right, by the extremes on both, and I don't want to create a false equivalence. I'm sorry to say the left is way worse on this than the right. I just wanted to kind of invite people in. And I wanted them to see how Israel's, on the one hand, changing, indeed, as you point out. And on the other hand, some of the issues remain. I mean, one of the extraordinary things is I now think of my 168 co-authors. And every time I open the book, before Shavuot, before Pesach, and I put together a couple of texts that might be relevant, it's amazing how rich the conversation is, how current the conversation is, not just about Israeli politics, not just about the fight against anti-Semitism, but about deeper questions of who we are. And one of the things I'm doing now is I'm trying to translate the book into Hebrew. And not just really translate it into Hebrew, but translate it into Israeli, which means not translate it word for word as Arthur Hertzberg did in 1959, but to see what you need to add, what you need to cut, and make it not only a linguistic translation, but also a cultural translation, because Israel needs that conversation today. And Israel also needs to hear the diaspora voice. And Israel needs to hear the Mizrahi voice. And Israel needs to hear the female voice and all those identity voices that I added to the table. And one last thought, if I may, is that when I launched the book, you know, every author has to be both a megalomaniac and very, very humble. You have to be humble because most people ignore the writing, but what only keeps you up at night is somehow the hope that this book is going to change the world. But I always like to have a realistic goal. And I had what I thought realistic goal for this book, which was, the book came out on the 70th anniversary of the State of Israel. If I can launch 70 Zionist salons, 70 Zionist conversations like this, about who we are and who we can be, then I'll feel like I've succeeded. And I'm happy to say that this is probably number 220 or so. I've had them in person, online, in 5 different countries and 2 different languages, Hebrew and English. And I've seen it in people's eyes. When you invite people into a conversation about Zionism that isn't about Bibi and isn't about BDS and isn't about Palestinians, but is about who we are and who we can be, people relax and they soar. And that's what we need to do. We haven't allowed enough poetry back into the conversation because we're so stuck in the prose of fighting the good fight in the battle lines.
Thank you. I think this is a great segue to asking a few of the questions that have been sent in by our attendees. I'm going to kind of conceptually combine a couple of them. So you're talking about being proactive and making this a part of people's identity. So that's actually one of the questions we've gotten. How can we be proactive about fighting anti-Semitism, such as naming and shaming, when these very anti-Semites have monopolized the campus conversation against racism? And it's very, very relevant these days. How do you make the racist label stick on anti-Semites that are often self-characterized by their connection to or belonging to people of color or being historically disenfranchised?
So look, thank you for that. It's a very important question. It's heartbreaking that we've been blocked at the intersection. It's heartbreaking that concepts like white privilege are now being weaponized against us. And with both intersectionality and white privilege, there are important insights behind that. Yes, I mean, we Jews know that there is a kind of connectedness and common experience to suffering from bigotry, suffering from oppression, and also each one has its own unique voice. So why are we blocked at the intersection? Similarly, we have to acknowledge that in a society that continues to be stricken by racism and afflicted by very great color consciousness, I, as a white male, do have certain privileges. But the notion that Israel is a bastion of patriarchy or of white male privilege, first of all, pretends that all Jews are white, which we're not, and assumes that all Jews are rich, which we're not. And so baked into that are certain anti-Semitic and Jew-hating ideas. So look, the biggest mistake we make is that we spend too much of our time, too much of our energy trying to convince the unconvinced. You read a book like Jonathan Hates the Righteous Mind, and he makes it very clear that people's elephants, what he calls, go in certain directions, right? We spend too much time trying to convince those who are closed-minded. But I think we have to make the case. That's why I quote the BDS haters. I point out their anti-Semitic and anti-Zionist, not just implications, but agendas in real time, in real life. And I think we also have to make the case about the ongoing problem of us being blocked at the door, blocked at the intersection, and hope that the reasonable people listening in will listen in and not judge our successes by whether we convince Linda Sarsour. It's never going to work. And spending too much time worrying about it, we have to push back enough. But we also have to create a conversation where we have those intimate conversations. I was saying about taking personally and quoting Erwin Kotler, have those intimate conversations with our roommates if we're students, with our colleagues, not in the context of crisis, not in the context of hysteria, but wait a minute. This is just unfair. This is just unjust. How is it that we academics could make anything complex? The act of going to Starbucks. We could write 34 different scholarly papers about the economics of Starbucks and the anthropology of Starbucks and the history of coffee and on and on and on. And Israel is apartheid. Israel is evil. We love complexity and we come to this and it's so simplistic. Doesn't that mean that we're actually treating Israel differently? And when we single out Jews, we call that anti-Semitism. When we single out Israel, we call that xenophobia.
Okay, so the next one, again, it's a good segue from what you just said. There's a sort of real hatred that you hear expressed by Students for Justice in Palestine students and their adult supporters from within the community and in the faculty. How does one respond when some of the Jewish community and faculty decide to downplay these events and not consider the Zionist and Jewish students who are being impacted as being part of the power structure? And also, when considering the power structure, how does one most effectively communicate with those who are in positions of power, say department chairs, presidents, student affairs leaders?
So think of it, three different dimensions. So first of all, one of the problems we're dealing with is I call this the silence of the tenured lambs. it's very interesting. If you look when there have been initiatives like when there was an initiative to boycott on the Harvard campus, on the Columbia campus, the people who stand up are the scientists, are the medical types, because they know they cannot afford to boycott Israel. And the ones who are often front and center, and all too often, as you point out, I'm sorry to say, our Jewish colleagues, are the humanists. Now the humanists, I call them the silence of the tenured lambs. They have tenure. They should be committed to not just complexity, but openness, true diversity, that D word, true pluralism, that P word. And yet they've become the narrow-minded ones. And so again, name and shame, call them out on their hypocrisy, but don't spend too much time and too much energy. And most important of all, don't wait for the crisis. We only start coalition building when something blows up. We only start sitting down with the department chairs, the alumni who we really don't do a good job of tapping, the stakeholders, the president, when the problem has arisen. One of the things I love about you guys is that you're building an infrastructure, you're building relationships, you're building conversations about Israel and about Zionism, not in the context of crisis. And so when you have built up the relationships beforehand, then when the haters have their moment, you can shine a spotlight on them. And then you go to your colleagues, you go to people who've already established some kind of conversation about. And the key in all this, I think, is that phrase I was trying to introduce, which is educational malpractice. Because what I'm trying to weaponize here is a conversation that's desperately needed in universities. The great scandal of American higher education is most of us are hired and fired on the strength of our research. And those idiot parents and students who are paying $10, $20, $30, $70,000 a year are paying us for our teaching skill. And the conversation that needs to happen is what's happening in the classroom. And there's education malpractice because many of us are talkers but not teachers. There's education malpractice because many of us use the classroom and hijack it for our political purposes. And there's education malpractice because our Jewish students are not feeling particularly respected. And so we weave in the Jewish problem into the broader problem that all of us have failed to address.
Great. This is kind of an interesting question. This person has used your book as the primary text in his class on Zionism, but is there a more concise history text you can recommend as a companion to this? Because oftentimes he finds that the students struggle with these larger texts. What that says about the academic landscape is beyond the scope of this discussion.
No, it's a very important question. Look, I love every one of my 168 co-stars. I love and regret the 250 who ended up on the cutting room floor. But I do regret that the book is a little bit hefty. And one of the things I also wanted to do in phase 2 of this is cut the book down and make a kind of slimmer edition. And I started a conversation with some teaching colleagues and some high school teachers who are actually far more expert often at the art of education. And I just got distracted because I ended up writing a book this year with Natan Sharansky called Never Alone, which is coming out. So that ended up taking up that energy and working on the translation of the Zionist ideas. But we need a shorter, slimmer volume, which once upon a time would have been for the 15-year-old, but you're right, today is more for the 18 to 25-year-old crowd as well, that would take some of the key ideas and spread it around. So I think and also one of the other, phase 3 would be to take some of these and interview some of my Zionist thinkers who are alive and put it on short videos. And let's use the media we now have to bring the Zionist conversation alive. And so I could get into the bibliography of Zionism, but I think what I'm trying to model here is how we take what we have and start, it's not a nice word, cannibalizing it, or making it more digestible for different populations and different needs.
Gil, we are going to get back to you about all those ideas because I see a Gil Troy AN pamphlet in your future, or possibly a research paper in your future, or even we can do something interactive online. So stay tuned. I bet you didn't know that, like, you came onto our webinar and now we're going to
Lifelong commitment.
work a
I'm
lifelong
brainstorming
commitment.
here, yeah.
So, we have a number of questions that are coming in, and we are going to be able to save all these questions. We'll have ongoing conversations, and we might not be able to get to all of them. We do have a question that a few questions that have come in now that can be combined, I think. And one of them is, what do we do about criticism of Israeli policies that can become kind of dangerous, can be used, right? So we want to be open, we want to be critical. My grandmother used to always say, don't air your dirty laundry out, but we're, as academics, we're going to be critical, and we're going to let the chips fall where they fall. What do we do when we have others say, you can't do that because it'll be used by the propagandists? So do you have any, advice or insight on how, we can go about doing our work without having it get abused and misused?
Look, it's a very complicated question. Look, the older I get, the more I learn that the most moral way to educate and the most manipulative way to educate actually overlap. And, propagandists talk about inoculation. That's the manipulative part of things. Moral educators like me talk about complexity. And when I speak to students, one of the things I say is, if you walk away from this conversation and go, hallelujah, I see the light, you're scaring me. Because the next person is going to be funnier, is definitely going to be better looking, is going to be more charismatic, and you're going to see his or her light. But if you say, I see the gray, then the conversation begins. So I'm not afraid of complexity, and I'm not going to let the haters and their ability to hijack anything critical I might say stifle me. Look, I have a weekly column in the Jerusalem Post. It means that I save a lot of money on therapy, because rather than having to work it out with a therapist, I have 900 words once a week to work out whatever issues I have in public. I couldn't be an effective columnist if I didn't occasionally criticize Bibi Netanyahu, Benny Gantz, Yair Lapid. So I need criticism. And again, for a healthy democracy to grow and thrive and survive, we need to be critical. And here again, the intersection between morality and manipulation. As academics, we gain credibility by saying, look, I'm saying personally, I don't want to get partisan, but I called for Bibi Netanyahu to resign 2.5 years ago and save us all this debacle we're watching unfold week by week as the prime minister attacks the court system and get a pardon. So that enhanced, and I didn't do it in order to enhance my credibility on campus. I did it because that was honest. And I think, especially our students these days, they can smell a hypocrite, and they can smell an honest person who's struggling. And I think the more honest we are, the more open we are, the more effective we are. And that's the way forward. And we really need to figure out how to build those muscles. Not so I'm going to criticize Israel just to kind of buy credibility in a cheap way, but as part of the ongoing conversation, bringing people into the complexity. And one last idea, if I may, we're right now experiencing the Trump opportunity, I call. 75% of the American Jewish community hates Donald Trump, abhors Donald Trump. The academic community is probably 99.9%. And yet I haven't heard, I know it's happening a little bit on campus, but I haven't heard many people say, oh, because I hate Donald Trump, I hate America. I give up on America. And I checked, the Aliyah figures to Israel haven't soared, and the Aliyah figures to Canada haven't soared. The resistance is saying, no, I disagree with this president, and I want to change. So why is it the Trump opportunity should teach us how to be critical, liberal patriots, how to be critical, thoughtful patriots, how to say, yes, I can disagree with this prime minister, this policy, this approach, again, this O-word occupation, but I don't give up on the country itself. Because Israel is a complicated country, like all countries. All countries are imperfect. Zionism is the movement to say, A, we are a people, Am Yisrael. B, we have particular ties to a homeland. Doesn't preclude others having ties to that homeland, as we know from the Manhattan example and the Australia example. And C, we have the right to establish a state on that homeland. Am Yisrael, Eretz Yisrael, Medinat Yisrael. What are you disagreeing with? Are you deciding who I am? Are you trying to take away my right to express myself? Once again, we get to an inequality that on campus, everybody else is allowed to express themselves, but not me. So the Zionism is the whipping boy on campus. It should be the more open thing because it's an identity force. It's a essentialist force in a constructive way. And it's basically saying we are a people and we have the right to establish it. And Zionism is the movement to perfect Israel. So left, right, religious, non-religious should be able to coalesce around Zionism and be more critical about Israel if they wish.
Great. So we only have a few more minutes left. So I want to get to as many as possible. So I want to ask one sort of challenging question and one more, and end with one more inspiring question. So the first would be, how do we respond to colleagues, and especially in the faculty, who are Jewish and who are using their identity to promote anti-Israel claims? And I would combine that with what approach would you suggest where there's not even that much interest in the subject, where there might have been BDS or Israel delegitimization some years ago, but there's just not interest anymore. How do you inspire and engage people under those circumstances? And then as the last question, you mentioned poetry. This is a much more emotional perspective. How do we emphasize this effectively within academic discourse?
So first of all, I'll start with the last one, which is that, as an academic, I function in two modes. One is, yes, I want to be thorough and critical and thoughtful and objective, but in the classroom. But when I'm outside the classroom, when I'm on campus, I need poetry, I need emotion, I need inspiration. And that actually gets to the other part of the answer, which is that again, I've found that by inviting people into a conversation about Zionism, not in the context of the battle, but in the context of who we can be and the constructive conversation we need to have about liberal nationalism, all of a sudden we have opportunities to connect, to explore, to go beyond the politics. And I'm always very careful to say, look, I'm not using this as a dodge. I will answer any question you have about borders and boundaries and Israeli policies and all that. But first, let's go to the core. First, let's go to the fundamental questions. First, let's go to the key ideals. And so that's the kind of conversation we need to start modeling. And I've seen, as I said, that people are going, wow, this is really an opportunity to change the conversation and to change the tone. We fall into the tone building and setting of our enemies because we're always in crisis, because we always define ourselves not by the 73% of Americans who consistently support Israel, but by the 2, 3, 4% who really truly hate Israel, and the 15, 20% who've been hypercritical. And when it comes to the Jews who are in the front there, read Howard Jacobson, who calls them out as a Jew, right? As a Jew, I disagree with Israel. Well, have you, as a Jew, ever done anything else? And I'll quote one of my great heroes, who was pointed out again and again that indeed you can be Jewish and anti-Semitic, and we've seen this in so many ways.
Well, Gil, it's the witching hour, and I just want to thank you on behalf of AN's leadership team and our entire membership and those who have joined us today. Thank you so much. Yasher koach to you for all the work that you do. We're delighted that we were your 221st salon, and there'll be many more. And you have another book coming out, by the way, everybody. It's called Never Alone. It's written with Natan Sharansky. It's going to be another really important book. We look forward to reading it, having you back. I want to, thank all of those who stayed tuned, and stay tuned for other AN webinars that we'll have in the coming weeks. As we mentioned, we have saved the questions, although I think we got through almost all of them. So stay tuned for further notices through AEN's email about more events online. Gil, stay well, stay healthy. Everybody stay well, stay healthy, and have a very good rest of your day. Thank you so much for joining us.
Hag Sameach, thank you very much.
Hag Sameach. Bye-bye, everybody.